Nem beszélek magyarul, ezért angolul kell előadnom. Kérlek, bocsássatok meg. Again, I'm sorry I cannot speak Hungarian. My father never taught me. Sorry. I would like to speak to you today a little bit about my own research into the evolution of human diet and teeth and how we reconstruct that, looking at tiny traces on teeth. Think about your teeth for one moment. They have to break without themselves being broken up to millions of times over the course of your lifetime. And they have to do it built from the same raw materials as the foods that you eat. Nature is really an inspired engineer, and teeth teach us this. Think about the antelope with flat teeth that are perfect for grinding tough grass. Or the lion with sharp blade-like teeth for slicing through meat. Or the hyena with flat teeth for crushing hard nuts. Teeth are designed for whatever food it is that you have evolved to eat as a species. But what about us? What about our ancestors? What are their teeth designed for? Well, this has been the subject of my research for many, many years. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about my core research, how tooth shape relates to diet, microscopic wear analysis. These are the tiny scratches and pits in your teeth, and what they can teach us about the diets of our ancestors. After that, I'll spend a few moments talking a little bit about other applications of microwear analysis, the fossil primates of Hungary that lived 10 million years ago, Africa's last hunter-gatherers, people who eat a traditional diet of wild foods, and then whether we can use microwear to study the diets of mammals in the Arctic today as climate is changing. I'll start with my core research. We think about the way teeth work usually from an engineering perspective. Aristotle, I think, said it best thousands of years ago. Teeth have one job: to break food. And if we are to think like engineers, we want to think about, okay, what is the most efficient tool for breaking down foods with specific properties? So for example, if you eat bone or hard nuts, a hammer and an anvil works well. In the case of a tooth, that would be a rounded cusp fit into a basin. If you eat tough foods like meat or leaves, a blade, a set of shears or scissors make the most sense. In this case, in the case of a tooth, that would be crests. So we can ask ourselves, how close do teeth actually come to the mark as it goes? So here are three closely related monkey species. This is a langur that eats leaves, a mangabey that eats hard nuts, and a macaque that eats soft fruits. And the teeth look very similar, but there are subtle differences. For example, the leaf monkey has longer shearing blades than the hard object feeder, and the soft fruit eater is in the middle. So we should be able to use the shapes of teeth to say something about diet in the past. But is it really that simple? Nature's never simple. And in fact, if you look at closely related species, in this case we have two species of mangabeys, and they both have flat teeth and thick enamel for crushing hard foods. But this one here, the sooty mangabey from the Ivory Coast, eats hard nuts the whole year round, every day. But this one is a closely related mangabey that lives in Uganda, doesn't eat hard nuts, except only when it's necessary, maybe 1 or 2 times a year. Gorillas have sharp, cresty teeth for shearing tough leaves and stems. And mountain gorillas, those living at high altitudes, they eat mostly leaves and stems because that's all there is. However, those that live at lower elevations, lowland gorillas, prefer and eat soft fruits most of the year. So similar teeth and jaws, capable of processing the same mechanically challenging foods when needed, but different food preferences. This brings up the idea that food choice is driven by availability. And I call this the biospheric buffet concept. All right, if you think about it, I think of the biosphere, that part of our planet that has life, as a giant buffet table, right? Like a Chinese buffet you might go to downtown, where nature puts different foods on the table at different times in different places. Animals will go with their plates and they'll pick and choose. I want this, I want this, I want this. But the food choice is not about the teeth. The teeth are the utensils. They're the forks and knives and spoons. So they're important, but they don't determine what an animal eats. They don't determine why a chimpanzee eats soft fruits in the forest or why a baboon eats grass on the savannah. Those are determined by what's available. So can we use teeth at all to talk about what animals want to eat, what they eat on a daily basis? Yes. This is a topic that I call foodprints, which are like footprints in the sand. They're traces of actual activities of animals that were alive in the past. And I look at microwear, the microscopic scratches and pits that form in teeth as a result of its use. So for example, a nut-eating primate like this capuchin will have pits where the teeth crush those nuts, like a hammer and anvil. A leaf-eating primate, like this howling monkey, will have scratches as the teeth shear into each other like a pair of scissors. The abrasives getting dragged along the surface, creating long parallel scratches. And I've spent much of my career developing tools that will allow us to measure these things in a way that allows us to reconstruct diet. And we see it not just in monkeys. We see the same pattern when we look at antelopes. This is a tough leaf eater. This is a hard fruit eater. This is a cheetah that eats mostly tough meat. This is a hyena that crushes hard bone. This is a panda that eats tough bamboo. This is a black bear that eats a variety of different kinds of foods. So we see the same pattern of differences regardless of the species that we're looking at. And I've developed techniques, as I said, for measuring these things. We call, the one developed in my lab, called microwear texture analysis, right? We start with a confocal profiler, which creates a three-dimensional rendering of the surface. This is about 1/10 of a millimeter, so tiny, tiny area on the tooth. I worked with engineers at Worcester Polytechnic Institute to develop a method called scale-sensitive fractal analysis that allows you to come up with numbers that characterize the surface. So for example, a lot of pits, high complexity. A lot of scratches, high anisotropy. So a hard object feeder would have a complex isotropic surface, a tough food feeder, a simple anisotropic one. And this leads to hypotheses. So for example, let's say that you have a bunch of soft, tough food feeders, like leaf eaters. You expect them to have lower microwear texture complexity. If you have a bunch of hard object specialists, much higher complexity. If you have a hard object fallback feeder, that is an individual that eats hard foods only very rarely, but most of the time eats soft ones, its signal should look more like a soft, tough food feeder with a few points out toward the hard extreme. So these two may have the same shaped teeth, but these two have more similar patterns because the diets are different. This is exactly what we find. Here is our langur, our leaf eater, our hard object specialist, and our soft fruit eater, higher and higher complexity. Here we have a hard object fallback feeder. Its teeth look just like the hard object specialist, but the general pattern looks more like the soft fruit eater with a few points out towards the extreme, exactly as we predict. But what about our ancestors? What do we know about their teeth from microwear and other things? For those of you who are not familiar with human evolution, I'll just take one moment to give you a summary. We have a great fossil record. It spans about 7 million years, your evolution. And basically, there are 4 main groups that we can identify. The first group we can call Ardipithecus and friends between about 7 and 4.5 million years ago. maybe human ancestor, very close, either way, lived in the woodlands of Africa, still in the trees. Then about between 4 and 2 million years ago, there's a group we call Australopithecus, which was starting to come down out of the trees because the savannas, the grasslands, began to spread across the continent. And then around 2.5 million years ago, there's a fork in the road. In one direction, this specialized group called Paranthropus, and in the other direction, our own biological genus, Homo. So that split around 2.5 million years ago as the savannas were spreading further and further across the continent. So what do the teeth teach us? Well, when you look at something like Ardipithecus, the teeth are very generalized. Okay, so the teeth are not very big or very small, not very cresty or very flat, not very thick enamel or very thin. What you would expect of a soft fruit eater. But when we get to to Australopithecus and especially Paranthropus, you get more and more specialization for harder or more abrasive foods on the open savanna. But in our own genus, Homo, the teeth get smaller, the enamel gets thinner, they get a little crestier, it looks more generalized. And we start to see stone tools with bones with cut marks on them, suggesting butchery. So the diet began to include meat. That's the basic idea. But is it that simple? Remember the biospheric buffet. Here is microwear complexity values for many of these species. On the left here, we've got soft, tough foods. On the right, hard, brittle ones. In red, Australopithecus. In blue, Paranthropus. In green, Homo. So for Australopithecus, very low complexity, especially the earlier form, afarensis. But in general, low complexity. And then in Paranthropus, it's interesting, we get two different patterns. These two look the same. This one's in East Africa, this one's in South Africa. The East African form has low complexity like its ancestor, Australopithecus. But the South African form has much wider complexity values. Same anatomy, different microwear. Looking at our ancestors, Homo, we start with something like habilis that has a broader range than Australopithecus, but still not much. But the later ones, erectus, Neanderthals, Naledi, have a broader range of diets still. So to give you a summary of this, we start with a narrow diet, Australopithecus, and it gets broader into Paranthropus, at least one species, but another species that looks exactly the same has a much narrower diet. For our own ancestors, Homo, we see what looks like a progressive, we don't use the word progressive in evolution, but what looks like increasingly broad diet through time, from early to late Australopithecus, then early to late Homo. And we can explain this by looking at the biospheric buffet concept. Paleoclimatologists have reconstructed the environments in Africa over the course of human evolution for a very long time. And we know that there are two patterns to the climate. For example, as time goes on, it gets cooler and drier as the savannas are spreading. But the amplitude of the swings back and forth between warm and wet and cool and dry are increasing also. And so what this tells us is that nature is changing the items on the buffet table more and more rapidly. Perhaps that explains why there's a broader diet in our ancestors over time. We're adapted to a more versatile diet. And this brings us to the paleo diets. I assume these are big in Hungary. They're big all over the world, right? The most recent one is, I think, called the carnivore diet. And these have sold tens of millions of copies. They're based on the idea that we should eat more like our ancestors. There is a mismatch between what we eat today and what our ancestors evolved to eat. So we have heart disease, type 2 diabetes, several forms of cancer are related to the fact that we don't eat what we're evolved to eat. That's the idea. And people often ask me, well, what did we evolve to eat? The question makes no sense because, as you know, as we've already said, our diet has changed over time. Our lineage is a work in progress. Not just that, but any given species will eat different foods probably. In the savanna, by the river, by the lakeshore. And so maybe the real answer here, what's unique about our diet is our diversity, our versatility, the fact that we can find something to eat on all of our planets, biospheric buffets. Maybe that's why we were able to spread so far and take over this planet. People on the north slope of Alaska, in the Arctic, eating nothing but marine mammals and fish. Those living on the equator, 70% of their calories from sugary melons and starchy roots. And it's our interesting diet, our versatile diet, and our teeth that allow it, that have given us this success. So very quickly then, how about some other fun applications of microwear? Some of you may be familiar with the fact that here in Hungary, 10 million years ago, there were monkeys and apes that were sort of swinging around in the trees in the northern part of your country here. Of course, Hungary didn't look much like it does today, 10 million years ago. In fact, there was a giant inland sea called the Pannonian Sea that covered most of the country. Here's where we are in Budapest right now. We're a bit close to underwater. In the northern part of the country, we get the northern shore of this lake. There's this site called Rudabanya that has a very close connection, actually, with ELTE and with the Geological Survey. Today, it's a beautiful area. There's this beautiful lake and woods for having a nice picnic. In the past, it was the site of many, many years of excavation. This is back in the early 1990s when I participated with the late Laszlo Kordos in his excavations. Here's me up here, actually. And there are some strong connections with ELTE. Gabor Hrnyak was the geologist that worked at the mine that came here at first. He found the first primate. Not only that, but he gave that primate to Miklos Kretzoy, who, in fact, started many, many years of excavation. Both Hrnyak and Kretzoy are graduates of ELTE. In addition, Laszlo Kordos of the Geological Survey here in Budapest also had a long connection with ELTE and was a research faculty member here up until the time that he recently passed away. But what about the primates at Rudabanya? There are at least a couple of different forms. One group called Rudapithecus, an ape like a chimpanzee or an orangutan. One group called Anapithecus, which are sort of primitive monkey-like forms. And there's always been this debate. How could they live together, eating the same foods? Some said they lived in different areas. Others said, well, they didn't eat the same foods. Anapithecus ate leaves, Rudapithecus ate fruits. I figured I could look at the microwear and see. So I actually first did this. I started in the early 1990s, and I returned just a couple of years ago. Here are a couple of examples of microwear on the surfaces of these. And when you plot out the complexity values, here are the two Hungarian fossil primates. Here are fruit eaters, leaf eaters. They look kind of like soft fruit to young leaf eaters. But when you look more closely and zoom in, you can see there was a difference, significantly different, so that Rudapithecus seems to have consumed some harder foods, at least, than Anapithecus, perhaps letting them live together. Very quickly then, let's move from Hungary to the equator. I was fortunate enough to do some research with the last remaining hunter-gatherers, wild food eaters in Africa recently. And these are called the Hadza. They're in Tanzania, in the African Rift Valley. There are less than 100 left in all of Africa that eat these natural foods. And I was fortunate to live with them. And the men go out in the morning with their bows and their arrows, and they'll hunt medium-sized game, things like antelope, bush pigs, monkeys. The women will stay around the camp, raise the children, collect fruits, dig up roots, things like that for their diets. And they'll all meet at the end of the day for a meal. The one thing that's distinctive about this group is their diets vary throughout the year. In the rainy season, they eat fruits because that's what's ripe. They're plant eaters. In the dry season, visibility is good. There's a lot of game. They eat mostly meat. So I said, you know what? I can tell the difference between fruit and meat, or plant and meat eating, and maybe apply that to our own ancestors, especially because they live in the same place with access to the same foods. And so I went to Hadzeland, took impressions of their teeth, and generated microwear over the course of rainy and dry seasons. And we do see differences in their microwear. Women, men, dry season, rainy season. So men have more variation in microwear in the dry season, women in the rainy season. It's not so simple as meat versus fruit, but there is an interesting pattern. All right, finally, we can also, I think, use microwear to trace climate change, to understand the impacts of climate change on animals. And I've been working in the high Arctic. I used to work in Russia, in the Yamal Peninsula of northwestern Russia. And in the early 2020s, I shifted, because of the war, to Norway. But I'll present a little bit of work from my work in Russia. Now, you cannot go out and watch animals eat, right, as the ice melts, as the glaciers retreat, and see how climate change is impacting the biospheric buffet and what's available to these animals. But you can study teeth that have been collected. This is the Yamal Peninsula. It is 700 kilometers in length. We have boreal forest in the south and high tundra in the north. And it goes from forest to woodland to open low tundra to high tundra. And you can look, for example, at the rodents. These are lemmings. And you can see the microwear patterns as you go north. As it gets drier and more dusty, the number of microwear scratches on the incisors increases. So we can use microwear to track changes in the environment over space or time. One more, final slide. We can look at the animals that eat these lemmings. As you may or may not know, lemmings cycle. They go from peak periods where there are many, many, many lemmings to trough periods when there are very, very few lemmings. Lemming-rich years, lemming-poor years. And I figured I'm going to look at the foxes in lemming-rich and lemming-poor years and look for a difference in microwear. Because in the lemming-rich years, they eat nothing but rodents. In the lemming-poor years, then they have to look for other things. They have to scavenge the bones of reindeer, things like that. And in fact, you can actually see, here's a lemming-rich year microwear pattern and a lemming-poor year microwear pattern. And you can actually see the pits caused by bone. And when you look at the complexity values, the averages are the same, but you get a few up towards this high end of the spectrum. And this is interesting, when we look at the back fat, we actually had the back fat of these Arctic foxes. Those with no back fat, these are ones that are starving, very hungry. Those are where we see the high complexity. They're the ones that are willing to risk breaking their teeth because they're so hungry. And so at the end of the day, we can use microwear to say a great deal of things about the past, the present, and hopefully the future. Köszönöm szépen.